Welcome, online viewers. This is the sixth lecture in our series, The 50 Years That Changed Painting. I'd like to thank the Australian National University for hosting this event, the Drill Hole Gallery for organising and administrating, and Director Tony Oates for inviting me to do this series. Andrew Dyer and Donna Marie Kelly have generously sponsored the series and its transfer online. In 1945, the art historian André Chastel wrote about the group of artists who had called themselves the Nabis, a group of perhaps 8 or 9 artists at the core, but expanding to approximately 17 adherents, taking into account some of their informal associations. Chastel wrote that had the Nabis wanted to make such a bold decision, abstract art could have been invented around 1895. Such is the benefit of hindsight. It would appear that non-objective painting, abstract painting, had loomed as an imminent possibility, both in theory and in practice at a particular moment. The two artists you see on the screen, Maurice Denis and Edouard Vuillard, appear to have been for a limited time the most alert to, the most receptive to that dawning possibility. The self-portraits you see here were painted in 1889 and 1890, respectively, when Maurice Denis was 19 and Vuillard 22 years old. They had a background in common and friends in common, and Maurice Denis was a prodigious young man, astonishingly clever and well-informed, and Vuillard, in spite of his shyness and spells of self-doubt, was well and truly a genius, if judged purely by his aptitude as a painter and graphic artist. Vuillard and Maurice Denis were products of a posh Parisian high school, the Lycée Condorcet, and 2 others in the Nabi group, Pierre Xavier Roussel and Aurélien Lunier-Poe, were Vuillard's schoolfellows there. 2 points worth noting in this regard. The poet Stéphane Mallarmé had been a teacher at the Lycée Condorcet up until 1884 and had become a legend at the school. And 2 years behind Vuillard was the future novelist Marcel Proust, whose path crisscrossed in some significant ways with Vuillard's. Maurice Denis and Edouard Vuillard came of age during the era in France known as the Third Republic, when the official culture, the culture of the state, still carried tremendous authority, and when the city of Paris became the world's greatest showplace, as Walter Benjamin put it, the capital of the 19th century. The Universal Exhibition of 1889 drew more than 32 million visitors and featured the exhibitions and individual pavilions from 35 countries, including India, Persia, Siam, Hawaii, El Salvador, New Zealand, and Tasmania. Plus, the simulacrum of a street in Cairo, you see on the left, plus simulacra of villages in French colonies inhabited by native peoples. Real native people imported and put on display for the occasion, much to their dismay and disgruntlement. And of course, the Eiffel Tower, the masterpiece of modern engineering, was the centerpiece. Maurice Denis and Edouard Vuillard were therefore painting their self-portraits and beginning to take stock of who they were and where they were as artists in the full revelation of this overwhelming imperialistic spectacle of Western power, capitalism, technology, and trade in all its global ramifications. The flashpoint for the Nabis was triggered by this painting, dating from October 1888, that Paul Serusier painted under instruction from Paul Gauguin. Serusier was a student at the Académie Julian in Paris. He was 25 years old and happened to be vacationing in Brittany with his parents when he struck up a conversation with a painter, Émile Bernard, who subsequently introduced him to Gauguin. Gauguin had exhibited in 5 out of the 8 historic Impressionist exhibitions, the last of which had taken place 2 years before, in 1886. So, in effect, Gauguin was in an interim period, following a trip to Martinique, also following the disastrous failure of a project to establish an artists' colony in the south of France with Van Gogh and Émile Bernard. Gauguin was reinventing himself in Pont-Aven, where Serusier happened to meet him, and Gauguin had already attracted a group of acolytes there who were drawn to his strong personality. Gauguin had a sort of messiah complex, and there was an embryonic school of Pont-Aven already established by the time Serusier had his fateful encounter. Gauguin offered to give Serusier a painting lesson. They went off to a parkland called the Bois d'Amour, close to the hotel where they were staying. We don't know the exact words of Gauguin's instruction, but they would have been something like this. Aim, above all, for synthesis. Synthesis pertains to form and color and can be attained by paying maximum attention to the overall effect. Don't stay too close to nature. Art is an abstraction. Take from nature, dream in front of nature, but pay more attention to the evolving creation. Seek the synthesis of form and color by concentrating on the overall effect. That's my paraphrase of advice Gauguin gave in various statements and letters. This sketch, painted on cedarwood, you can see bits of the color of the unprimed cedarwood peeking through the brushstrokes. It measures only 27 centimeters by 21.5 centimeters. The support wasn't the lid of a cigar box, as was commonly supposed for a long time. You can see that it wasn't from the back of the panel on the right. Seruzier took this panel, still wet, on the train back to Paris the following day and showed it to his fellow students at the Académie Julian. Their response wasn't immediate. It would take a while for the painting to exert its magical effect, but ultimately its impact would be momentous and transformative. Two heads are better than one, the saying goes, and something unique and utterly unprecedented happened in the subjective space shared by Gauguin and Seruzier that day in the Bois d'Amour. It seems that by ceding control to one another, neither artist was actually in control of the fabrication of the image. The image was, so to speak, creating itself. Putting their heads together must have been disinhibiting. There was no judgment, no censorship of the audacity of what they were doing. But conversely, an extraordinary clarity, confidence, and trust in where their intuition was leading, the intuition which in that moment they shared. And the decision when to stop, when to leave off. Who made that decision? Was it both of them or one of them? We have no idea. The most astonishing fact, for me at least, is that Gauguin, on his own, never painted anything so fresh and perfect, with such a sublime economy of means. Furthermore, there's no other painting by Seruzier that bears any resemblance to this, even after it became so venerated in Paris as a kind of totem of Nabi painting, considered by others to be the benchmark of Nabi originality and radicalism. To paint with naive vehemence, to exaggerate fearlessly, and to shirk deliberately any effort to match the tonality of nature, that was Gauguin's advice to Seruzier. But it was only the beginning of the lesson, as a cursory glance at the painting reveals. The color's fierceness and gaudiness is not nearly as striking as the rigorous formal organization, the degree of abstraction. In fact, Gauguin's notion of synthesis could precipitate exactly such an effect, and here's a shining example of it. The motif of the talisman is evened out. Foreground, middle ground, and background are run together on a single plane, and the image has been made congruent with the surface and shape of the panel. Regular, rectangular brushstrokes are arranged in an orderly, almost methodical configuration. There are clusters and cadences hinting of Cézanne, hinting heavily of Cézanne, it should be said. Here's an example of Cézanne using those regimented parallel brushstrokes, which Gauguin's hatchings, the sort of tapestry effect he developed, sought to emulate. Seruzier, in turn, would go in for the tapestried look. In 1889 and 1890, Seruzier returned to Pont-Aven. Here, he and Gauguin are painting side by side. Seruzier is probably the best of Gauguin's acolytes in the school of Pont-Aven, even though there's also a Parisian provocateur and troublemaker at the Académie Julian who goes by the name of Paul Serusier. Maurice Denis also was attending painting classes at the Académie Julian at the time, and he was still at high school. He proved to be tremendously receptive to the new gospel Serusier had brought back from Pont-Aven. Such was Denis' enthusiasm that at some point Serusier placed the talisman in his keeping. He made a gift of it to Maurice Denis. Through his exposure to the talisman, Denis produced a rash of small experimental paintings. The fact that these works have survived, that Denis never disavowed them, that he took pride in how they had triggered dynamic interchanges between himself and others, tells us a great deal. There were others who became drawn into the Nabi circle and applied their talents and their wits to equivalently audacious, outrageous pictorial experiments. These are two self-portraits by Vuillard, one from 1890, the other from 1891. A totally radical application of the principles that Gauguin expounded as synthetism. That's what you're seeing here. August 1889 saw the publication of a theoretical defense of the talisman and the experimental Nabi paintings it had inspired among Serusier's acquaintances. The Nabi Manifesto was penned by the amazingly precocious 19-year-old Maurice Denis with an opening sentence that has become famous. It must be remembered that before being a warhorse, a naked woman, or some anecdote or other, a picture is essentially a plain surface covered with colors arranged in a certain order. Hard to imagine from our vantage point that this was a battle cry, that these were fighting words, that this statement could be in any way contentious or subversive, although it certainly was. Maurice Denis had grown up as an extremely pious boy in a very religious Catholic family. Vuillard described Denis as a mystic. He'd been educated in idealist philosophy by a clerical tutor, the Abbé Vallée, and was antagonistic in principle to realism and naturalism in art, with an ingrained dislike of the empirical basis of Impressionist painting. Denis began his polemic by questioning what is the nature that painters purport to represent, and why should its appearance differ so markedly in the work of various artists and in different periods. Next, he questions the part played by subjectivity, a question that had been raised so radically by the Impressionists 2 decades earlier. He scoffs at the purported truth value of representational art. And at the climax of his argument, he hopes out loud that he's convinced readers that empirical approaches to nature can never attain the truth, and that reality is unrepresentable and therefore unpaintable. He approvingly cites Gauguin's precedent in turning away from Impressionism and rejecting Naturalism, the hallmarks of the new post-Gauguin art he calls neo-traditionism. And those hallmarks are the pure arabesque, as little trompe-l'oeil as possible, fullness of color, a planar conception that accords with the wall, features associated with decoration that underline a stylized, basically decorative conception, and a rejection several times repeated, of l'effet littéraire, of literariness, that is to say, of storytelling, anecdotage, topicality, illustration. The Nabis made a common cause of their antipathy towards literary effects, but the reasons for their rejection differed in each case, and it's important to grasp their different motivations. For Maurice Denis, literary art meant profane art, and in theory and practice, Denis believed his mission was to restore the spiritual in art. That's not made explicit in the Nabi manifesto, but it comes out loud and clear in Denis' later publications. Denis must have consulted others, Seruzier first and foremost, before the definition of neo-traditionism was published. Seruzier was also devoutly religious, as were Jan Verkade and Morgens Balin, later fringe members of the Nabi group. These three maintained a close relationship, a discipleship, more like it, to Gauguin and to other painters in the Pont-Aven school, focusing on rural Brittany and its peasant life, whose imagery reflected the artists' anti-materialism, their rejection of city life, and their suspicion of modernity. At the time of the Universal Exhibition of 1889, they'd opted to attach themselves to a world apart. This is the only Nabi painting Seruzier is known to have done, apart from the Talisman, and it represents Paul Rançon, a fellow student at the Académie Julian, and one of the first to be won over to the new aesthetic. There was a particular strain of humor that sprung up among this group of delinquent art students, calling themselves Nabis, titling Seruzier's landscape The Talisman, representing Rançon as a bishop or a magus. These were part and parcel of a humorous reflex whose function was both to acknowledge and to make light of their Catholic piety, and the high-minded earnestness they channeled into their art. Nabi is a Hebrew word meaning prophet. So they would address one another with mock reverence and pretend that their association was an esoteric cult, that it had its own secret code words and customs. Nabi paintings, some Nabi paintings, maybe only the little ones, were called icons. And maybe there were prints and drawings which were also called icons, but that seems unlikely. During the summer of 1890, Paul Hanson lent Vuillard his studio on the Boulevard Montparnasse, and three of them, Maurice Denis, Hanson, and Vuillard, used to meet on a regular basis, either in the studio or in a neighborhood bistro. Bonnard, Serusier, and Ebels would sometimes join them. Each was required to bring an icon, and the challenge was to confront the others with something as out of the ordinary as possible, provocative, outrageous, hilarious, that transgressed the boundaries, that burlesqued or overstated the Nabi objectives, making them laughable, and coming up with something completely out of keeping with expectations of style, of skill, of the laws of moderation held by the friends you thought you knew. We've seen examples of such icons by Maurice Denis and by Vuillard. Here are some of Denis' works. And here on the right, another one by Bonnard, showing Vuillard in the street. It's actually an L-shaped painting. Another one by Bonnard, the viewing subject, the person looking into the scene, has represented his own knee and hand holding a pipe, and the curdling smoke and wallpaper pattern seem to have become one and the same thing. The depth of field in this painting has been completely negated. And as with the talisman, the image is made congruent with the surface and shape of its format. These small paintings rank among the most advanced works by the Nabis, but few, if any, were exhibited in public, as far as we know. Indeed, some seem unworthy. They're far from being the artist's best work, whereas others are absolute dazzlers. However, perhaps both the good and the bad could help explain the confidence and clarity with which the Nabis were able to tackle diverse and unprecedented idioms in painting, in the graphic arts, in theater design, in interior decoration, and so on. They learned to trust their intuition. They encouraged the workings of intuition, the practice of intuition in one another. An icon was an esoteric charm, intense, impersonal, whose color and form should speak to the soul. Vuillard lived with his mother, a widow, who supported her family by running a business in dressmaking. Madame Vuillard was an unlikely muse for a painter, you might think, and here she is again in a perfect little painting, more than perfect, exquisite, a gem, an icon, dated circa 1891, though I'm not sure that it's so early. It's a painting on cardboard. Vuillard developed a taste for painting on cardboard in preference to canvas. And it's not painted in artist's colors. It's painted with commercial enamel paints without a great deal of mixing. It's the first time commercial house paint is used by a serious artist. This wasn't an icon, it's a lithograph, but the boldness and flair of its treatment relate obviously to those Nabi watchwords, the pure arabesque, fullness of color, as little trompe-l'oeil as possible. And Maurice Denis could knock off hauntingly beautiful, faux naive little masterpieces like this moonlit scene, so wonderfully subtle in the infinitesimal intervals of color between gray, brown, green, and yellow, with a golden moon reigning over all. A relative latecomer to the Nabi circle, Félix Vallotton, comes onto the scene and he becomes one of Vuillard's closest friends. Vallotton described his relationship with Vuillard in the 1890s, saying, "The ideas of the one pass to the other like water from a carafe to a glass." In 1890, near the beginning of the Nabi Association, Maurice Denis wrote to Serusier and flatly declared that Gauguin would be proposed as the dominant personality of neo-traditionism. And yet, among the members of the Nabi group, they didn't behave like a clan of typical primates conceding authority to a dominant male. It was the reticent, hesitant Vuillard they looked up to, whom they considered as the great talent, the great hope amongst them. In the same letter to Serusier, Maurice Denis singles out Vuillard, whose calm and joy came to him as a pleasant surprise after 3 years of fever and uncertainty. He produces with such ease the most delicate things one can dream of, always with unexpected elements in his exquisite forms." Unquote. In 1891, Bonnard and Vuillard shared a studio in Pigalle, and Denis had a studio in the same building. The game of dare that they had developed among themselves goaded each of them into an extraordinary independence of judgment, or, if you like, of genuine originality. The speculative activity inherent in their production of icons would have raised questions like, is this a sketch or a fully fledged painting? Does it work? Is it good? Is it ugly or beautiful? Do you think this is something I've painted myself or something I found, painted by a 5-year-old, by someone completely uneducated and unskilled? Is this the most ridiculous painting you've ever seen? Isn't this the most bizarre and discordant color combination imaginable? The repercussions of speculations like this were immense and fed directly into more complex and ambitious undertakings. This astonishing painting by Vuillard from 1891, for example, with a seamstress in the middle who has a pea green complexion with olive green hair and matching dress, and the fantastic ripple tinged with salmon pink that cuts into the profile on the left, the little black and white speckles of the reflection in the mirror, the extraordinary way of suggesting folds in a garment by juxtaposing two different greens on the right. The grammar and syntax of the painting, the role played by color and texture, are flagrantly novel here, and it seems a long shot to evoke neo-traditionism in relation to a painting like this. Bonnard's Game of Croquet, painted in 1892, is relatively large, 1.3 meters by 1.6 meters, with its shapes and textures fitted together in a blatantly artificial, anti-naturalistic manner. Bonnard had seen a huge exhibition of Japanese woodblock prints at the École des Beaux-Arts in 1890, which turned his head. Vuillard, Maurice Denis, and those in the Nabi inner circle were lastingly affected by their exposure to Japanese printmaking and by this exhibition in particular. Bonnard recounted the impact it had on him. Quote, "I realized that color could express everything, as it did in this exhibition. With no need for relief or texture, I understood that it was possible to translate light, shape, and character by color alone, without the need for tonal values. That is to say, without chiaroscuro, without volumetric modeling, without atmospheric effects, without spatial plotting, without pictorial illusionism in all its familiar forms." Again, one needs to ask, what has this to do with neo-traditionism? In 1891, Bonnard became suddenly famous because of the poster he made for a brand of champagne, France Champagne. The posters went up on the Morris columns and hoardings all over Paris. Nothing like them had been seen before, and within weeks, these hand-drawn, idiosyncratic posters became the decor of the city, art for the people, so to speak. Toulouse-Lautrec, who was familiar to the Nabis because of his close friendship with Henri Gabriel Ibels, followed suit with a series of sensational posters that suggested everything new and exciting about contemporary Parisian life. Ibels, the Nabi, had a successful career as a graphic artist. In 1892, Maurice Denis produced the poster on the left for a newspaper based in Toulouse, The Dispatch, and painted 4 huge panels for a child's bedroom, the first instance of the decorative aesthetic of the Nabis being amplified into actual decor. Again, the question, what does this have to do with neo-traditionism? And how would Maurice Denis justify his fealty to Gauguin as the dominant personality of neo-traditionism. Gauguin was building his own legend at the time. Cerisier came in contact with him. He had a messianic complex, as I've said. He identified with the suffering Christ, the prophet outcast, and he'd cut off his ties with the Impressionists, with Pissarro and Monet notably, although very significantly, he'd kept up his contact with Degas. A remarkable young art critic came on the scene around this time. He shared many of his predilections, many of his prejudices with the Nabis, and like them, he had a strong sense of the tenor of the time. The romantic idea of the great artist as prophet, as saint, and martyr was sincerely held by Gabriel Albert Aurier. He found exactly what he was looking for in the moral examples set by Gauguin and Van Gogh. His landmark articles about them appeared in 1890 and 1891, before Aurier's life was cut tragically short at the age of 27 in 1892. Aurier was an aspiring poet attracted to symbolism, and he put front and center of his discourse these symbolist buzzwords: capital D, dream; capital M, mystery; capital I, idea. In his view, 19th century naturalism and realism, including and perhaps particularly Impressionism, had run their course. An aesthetic founded upon sensation, an art based on the imitation of natural appearance, was futile because it acknowledged nothing beyond itself. There was no yonder. There was no transcendental justification. Aurier thought Gauguin's art was a corrective to this nihilism and nullity. It was implicitly not just post-impressionist, but fundamentally anti-impressionist. And I quote, "Thanks to his gift, symbols, that is to say, ideas, surge from the shadows, bring to life an existence no longer just contingent and relative. Thanks to this gift, complete art, perfect, absolute art, exists at last," unquote. And here is how Aurier defines what Gauguin's exemplary art stands for in his estimation. It is idea art because its sole ideal is the expression of the capital I idea. It is symbolist because it expresses this idea through forms. It is synthetic because it inscribes its forms, its signs, in a commonly understood way. It is subjective because the object is never considered as an object, but as a sign perceived by the subject. It is decorative because decorative painting, in the strict sense, as the Egyptians understood it, as the Greeks too probably understood it, and the primitives, was nothing other than an artistic manifestation at one and the same time subjective, symbolist, synthetic, and ideaist. Okay, that's warmed up Plato. That's warmed up pre-Raphaelitism. The most positive, relevant contention here is the stress placed on art's decorative aspect. The most negative aspect is the loneliness, the alienation imputed to the artist in society. Let's remind ourselves that Augier is writing in the Paris of 1891, 2 years after the Universal Exhibition. He's writing from the capital of the 19th century, as Walter Benjamin put it, from Gay Paris, for God's sake. The art public, he says, and these are his very words, is a minuscule public, more or less intelligent, which is still preoccupied with the futile anachronism of capital A art. Academic art, the art of the art dealers, the art of commerce, impressionist painting, realist, naturalist painting can't be genuine art at all. Authentic art isn't something tied to the prevalent culture. It can't simply be an expression of its own place and time. And so, according to Augier, authentic art is anti-cultural, oppositional, individualistic. The art public, the genuine public, he says, is minuscule. It's not connected to the common culture. It holds itself apart. It's a coterie. But think of this. The Universal Exhibition hosted 3 major exhibitions. One of international art, more than 2,700 works. A huge survey of French art in the 19th century, held in the Trocadero Palace. A centennial exhibition of French art, 1789 to 1889, at the Palais des Beaux-Arts, consisting of at least 650 works. One of the guidebooks to the Universal Exhibition described the vast halls of paintings being, quote, a unique opportunity to orient oneself among the confusion of the present time. The present time, this journalist continued, was an epoch of the most unfettered individualism, spread out everywhere one turns. The most famous artists from the salons were there in strength. Meissonier with 19 works, Bastien Lepage with 25, and this painting by Bastien Lepage, portraying Joan of Arc with her vision of a knight in shining armor and the ghost of a bride, in fact Saints Michael, Margaret, and Catherine, was the must-see popular sensation of them all. The effect of contending individualism was exacerbated, no doubt, because for the first time, an official exhibition included non-academicians, not just Courbet and Manet, but also Monet and Pissarro, with 2 works each. Boudin with 3 works, and Cézanne with a single work. Yes, even Cézanne, who had obtained his first official acknowledgement. Was it the sheer glut of paintings seen by these massive crowds that persuaded Albert Aurier that there was actually no painting at all, and no appreciative public for any of it? Had quality been entirely subsumed by quantity? Had overstimulation and oversupply induced a kind of bulimia? I take it that this was a turning point in cultural history, in modernism, where we observe artists and intellectuals in full retreat from the public sphere. The idea that artists, the artists who really matter, are before their time, or well ahead of the prevailing taste, was by no means a new idea, but the contention that living art, the art that mattered most, was antagonistic to culture and was irreconcilable with it, was certainly a new idea, and Albert Aurier was a prominent representative of it, with Gauguin at that very moment creating a legend based on this assumption. The revolutionary history commemorated in 1889, the centenary of the overthrow of the Ancien Regime, brought home the realization that liberty, equality, and fraternity were relative, not absolute, and that the modern nation was permanently and incorrigibly disunited. In an interview published in 1891, Mallarmé summed up the realization that others were also sharing at the time. He said, "This is an unstable society lacking unity. No stable and definitive art can be created. From this incomplete social organization, which explains in itself the disquiet of the human mind, an unexplained need for individuality arises, of which the present literary and artistic manifestations are a direct reflection." Unquote. If we return one last time to Maurice Denis' definition of neo-traditionism, traditionism is understood by him to be, in a general sense, and in an overt sense, perhaps also, spirituality, the sacred, and in a covert sense, as it there was actually no doubt, it meant Catholicism and maybe even Catholic nationalism. But it's the neo aspect of neo-traditionism that really carried the day. If individualism was an inescapable condition of modern times, the Nabi group became a haven of sociability, of profound lifelong friendships, of creative ferment and cultural innovation. More to the point, the games, the dares they reveled in had the function of negating any sense of existential apartness and singularity. The Nabi paradigm, the talisman, was a folie à deux, a joint creation that seemed to have magically made itself. The Nabi's traffic in icons, with all the exuberance and hilarity this entailed, was entirely transformative for the participants. It involved an exploration, a sustained exploration of intersubjectivity. It promoted uh, empathy, it promoted commonality, the friendships and interchanges between Bonnard and Vuillard, between Vuillard and Vallotton, for example, are worthy of independent study. They were extraordinary and unique. The Nabi predilection and Vuillard's genius for depicting domestic interiors and celebrating familial intimacy and bourgeois sociability we'll examine presently, but I need to go back. Degas exerted a very powerful influence over Gauguin, over Seurat, over Toulouse-Lautrec, and over most, if not all, of the Nabis. In the late 1860s, Degas, along with Whistler, Monet, and others, had become smitten by their discovery of Japanese woodblock prints. Japanese prints suggested ways of shaking up the traditional grammar and syntax of pictorial composition, just as, in a perfect complement, their awareness of photographs could inspire novel ways of organizing pictures. In cosmopolitan Paris, with its cultural horizons vastly expanded by European colonization and defined by the epic scale of the Universal Exhibition, the rage to collect Japanese art had steadily grown. Siegfried Bing was the art dealer in Paris who specialized in Japanese art, and he published a monthly magazine, Le Japon Artistique, between 1888 and 1891. His gallery began to show other things: Tiffany lamps, glassware by Gallet, contemporary paintings, including now and then works by the Nabis. Félix Vallotton designed the poster for his gallery in 1896. The Nabis were, of course, direct forerunners of Art Nouveau. Vuillard was an avid collector of Japanese prints. Approximately 180 of them were found in his possession at the time of his death. You can imagine how exciting, how inspiring works like these would have been to someone who'd grown up in his mother's dressmaking workshop. The excitement of clashing patterns and riotous colors and the ingenuity of the Japanese artists, these prints are all by Kunisada, in organizing those disruptive and discordant phenomena was impressive and inspiring. Vuillard made a deep study of how these effects were achieved. The arabesque, the dynamic asymmetry, the schematization of color. Vuillard is inspired by these features. Using a very limited palette, paring back and abstracting the motif quite severely, distributing the same color as far as it could possibly go, using, for example, the identical dark red of the vertical for the fireplace, for the hair, for the shaded part of the garment, the same khaki green used for the picture frame, the door or window frame, the shadow of the face, the tumbling garment. Vuillard revels in these reduced color choices we would associate with printmaking rather than with painting. And he brings out a fabulous richness from these drab and uncompromising limitations. He was a great master, in fact, in the art of color lithography, maybe the greatest exponent of this ever. So in these tiny paintings, Vuillard comes closest to pure abstraction, but the Nabi conception of the decorative contains the prospect of abstract art in embryo. Everything in the image has to be made subordinate to the principle of unity and harmony. Everything in the image is understood as an interplay of shapes and colors. The physical reality of materials and of their handling is never disguised. The term pure painting came into currency in the Nabi milieu, and this is a very significant fact, historically speaking, because this term, pure painting, was Guillaume Apollinaire's name for abstract painting when it first appeared in Paris in 1912. However, even in 1912, pure painting meant much the same thing to the proponents of non-figurative art as it had meant to the Nabis, as Virginia Speight has pointed out. She wrote, "Pure painting did not necessarily mean non-representational painting. It signified painting which had its own internally coherent structure, independent of naturalistic structural devices." Far from the solitary confinement implied by the practice of easel painting, far from any ivory tower notions of purity or any snobbish ideas of art for art's sake, Vuillard and his closest friends were worldly, sociable, and gregarious. These two sheets of drawings by Bonnard lay out the meeting places, the common ground, so to speak, of the Nabi group. First is the view from the studio in Pigalle that Bonnard and Vuillard shared in their formative years. There was a third person sharing their studio, an old school friend of Vuillard's, who would become a leading theatrical director and actor, Lunier Poe, who seems to have used the studio as a refuge to learn his lines. He wasn't a painter. But the Nabis became intensely involved in Lunier Poe's productions. They went about designing and painting the sets for his plays. The earliest performances in France of plays by Ibsen, Strindberg, Gerhard Hauptmann, Maeterlinck, and even Alfred Jarry's proto-Dada play, Ubu Roi, were produced in Lunyepo's theatre. There was also a puppet theatre in Claude Terrasse's studio. Claude Terrasse was a composer who was Bonnard's brother-in-law, and the Nabis were also directly involved with the productions of puppetry held here. Another meeting place was Ambroise Volard's gallery. The Nabis would hang out there, and there you might run into Camille Pissarro, Degas, and Renoir. Bonnard gives us recognizable portraits of all three of these. Far from having any dogmatic aversion to Impressionism, Bonnard and Vuillard had nothing but admiration for their precursors. The editorial office of La Revue Blanche, the brilliant monthly review with which Vuillard, Bonnard, and Vallotton became closely associated. The proprietors, the Natanson brothers, are seen here in conversation, and the copy editor, Félix Fénéon, is bent over his desk. Coming through the door is Misia Natanson, who was the Nabi muse, the wife of the proprietor and editor-in-chief of La Revue Blanche. Posters for La Revue Blanche by Toulouse-Lautrec and by Bonnard. That's Misia in the Toulouse-Lautrec poster. She was an accomplished concert pianist who was trained by the composer Gabriel Fauré, and one artist after another fell desperately in love with her. Renoir, Vuillard, Bonnard, Vallotton, and Misia was happy to bask in their admiration and to have herself painted and drawn by all of the artists in her entourage. You can see in the woodblock print by Vallotton on the left the same wallpaper, the same lamp, the same piano depicted in the little painting by Vuillard, and quite possibly the bald man on the left in Vallotton's print represents Vuillard. Vuillard portrays Misia ensconced in golden lamplight amid riotously patterned fabrics, whereas Vallotton shows us that Misia lets her admirers follow her around the house, even into her boudoir. Vuillard, the unrequited lover, was adopted as a sort of pet in the Natanson household. But the magnificent idiosyncrasies of his depictions of their living room and their lifestyle suggest that these aren't so much paintings of them as paintings for them, intended to puzzle, to amuse, to astonish, to dazzle. I don't paint portraits, I paint people in their living rooms, Vuillard famously said. The Natansons' living room could be likened to a hothouse or a tropical aquarium. It's the metabolic relationship between people and their comfort zone that interests Vuillard, especially given Messia's magnetic presence. We learn to decode the various elements that make up the decor, the wall hanging, the piano, the plants, the lamps, the items of furniture, and where they are placed. Bonnard also brought along his paint box to take part in one of these cozy soirees, staring, no doubt lovelorn, at Messia. That's a Bonnard painting on the right, and of Vuillard on the left. Was Bonnard doing a nudge-wink impersonation of his friend Vuillard when he painted this work? It is probable that he was. Vuillard was a house guest at both of the Natanzons' country homes, and here too he produced very adventurous paintings, perhaps not so much of the Natanzons, but for them. This painting on plywood looks like it was done by a child or an amateur, flouting all the rules of composition, crowding together the elements on one side and cantilevering out an unrelieved expanse of blank wall on the other. When it's put into a frame, it resolves beautifully. And another great tour de force painted in the Natanzons' country home, a painting on cardboard. It's a tour de force of minimal means. When you get up close, it's like grabbing at dust. There's hardly anything there, just a lot of exposed cardboard. What a magician. We need to wrap up. We've run out of time. The schism that announced itself very early on between unworldly and worldly goals, between idealism and pragmatism, between religious faith and free thinking, between anti-impressionism and pro-impressionism, between the traditionism and the neo in the moniker neo-traditionism. Those differences didn't develop into open conflict because of the respect and affection that bound the Nabi group together. However, the differences would come to a head as the century drew to a close. The cartoon on the left shows what could happen at a family dinner. It shows how high passions could run. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a military officer of Jewish extraction, was accused of spying for Germany on trumped-up charges. Catholic nationalists whipped up an uproar of anti-Semitism, whereas freethinkers and Philo-Semites, notably the Revue Blanche editors and contributors, staunchly defended Dreyfus's innocence and fell in behind Émile Zola when Zola published his heroic broadside in the newspaper L'Aurore. Maurice Denis was a disgraceful anti-Dreyfusard, and so was Seruzier, and so were Degas and Renoir. But the dispute tore French society apart and splintered the Nabi group into factions. In 1900, perhaps as a gesture of reconciliation, Maurice Denis painted a group portrait pivoting around the art dealer Ambroise Vollard, the impossibly tall gentleman standing behind the easel, the whole painting centering around a Cézanne still life, which had once belonged to Gauguin. And the painting, the easel, guarded by a very angry-looking cat. There is Vuillard with his red beard on the left and Bonnard with his walking cane on the right. This was far from the end of everything for the artists represented here, but it did mark the end of the Nabis. In the 1890s, Kodak patented a box camera, and Vuillard became an enthusiastic photographer. And somehow his photographs, with their naturalistic proportions, with their tonalism, with their depth of field, became paradigmatic of paintings that he now wanted to make. Maybe also his friendships had become more comfortable and maybe more complacent and maybe less exciting. At any rate, Vuillard in the 20th century wasn't the tyro he'd been in the 1890s, and the subordinate role, the deferential role that Bonnard had played before, in his regard, no longer pertained. Their roles seem to have become reversed. The repercussions of Nabi painting were nonetheless robust and perennial, much more so than the Nabis knew, much more so than they understood. Vuillard described the faltering and decline of Nabi self-confidence as follows. The march of progress was so rapid. Society was ready to welcome Cubism and Surrealism before we reached what we imagined was our goal. We found ourselves, in a way, suspended in the air. But there were others who took up where the Nabis left off. Thank you for your interest. See you next time.